Harold Miller sat on his usual corner of 5th and Main, his weathered cardboard sign propped against his legs. The morning crowd rushed past him, their designer shoes clicking on the sidewalk, their eyes fixed straight ahead as if he were invisible. He'd been sitting in this same spot for 3 years now, ever since losing everything in the market crash that wiped out his retirement savings. The autumn wind whipped around the street corners, and Harold pulled his thin jacket tighter. At 72, the cold seemed to seep deeper into his bones with each passing year. But he couldn't afford to miss a day of collecting what little change people would spare. His Social Security barely covered the rent at the rundown motel where he lived. A group of office workers walked past, laughing about their weekend plans. Harold remembered when he used to be just like them, heading to his corner office at the ECE, investment firm, planning dinner parties and vacations. Now most days he was lucky if he collected enough for a hot meal at the diner down the street. The morning dragged on, and Harold's paper cup held only a few quarters and dimes. He was about to call it a day when a gleaming black Rolls-Royce pulled up to the curb. The car alone probably cost more than he'd made in his best year at the firm. Harold watched as the back door opened, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out. The man walked directly toward Harold, and for a moment, Harold thought he might be asked to move along. It wouldn't be the first time a business owner had complained about his presence, but instead the man stopped directly in front of him. "Mr. Miller?" "Harold Miller." The man's voice was deep and carried an accent that Harold couldn't quite place. "I've been looking for you." Harold stared up in confusion. No one had called him Mr. Miller in years. "Do I know you?" The man smiled, but there was something sad in his expression. "No, but I knew your daughter, Sarah. She worked for me before she passed away." Harold's hands began to shake. Sarah, his beautiful Sarah, the daughter he hadn't spoken to in 5 years before her death in a car accident 2 years ago. The daughter who'd begged him to stop drinking, to get help before he lost everything. The daughter whose funeral he couldn't attend because he couldn't afford the bus ticket to Boston. "My name is Alexander Chen," the man continued, kneeling down despite his expensive suit. "Sarah was my executive assistant for 3 years. She was exceptional at her job, but more than that, she was kind. She talked about you often." Harold felt tears welling up in his eyes. "She did. She never gave up hope that you would turn things around," Alexander said softly. "Even after you stopped answering her calls, she kept trying. She set aside money from every paycheck, hoping one day you'd accept her help." The shame that Harold carried every day grew heavier. He'd pushed Sarah away when she tried to help, too proud to admit he'd hit rock bottom, too drunk to see she was throwing him a lifeline. "When Sarah died," Alexander continued, "she left a letter. She asked me to find you, to help you if I could. It took my private investigators 2 years to track you down. I've been driving past this corner for weeks, working up the courage to—" "Stop." Harold couldn't speak. The weight of his mistakes, of his lost chances with Sarah, pressed down on him like a physical thing. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Miller," Alexander said. "Sarah believed in second chances. She believed in you. I'd like to honor her memory by offering you what she always wanted to give you, an opportunity to start over." A well-dressed woman emerged from the Rolls-Royce, carrying a thick manila envelope. She handed it to Alexander, who held it out to Harold. "In this envelope, you'll find the deed to a small apartment in Boston, paid in full. There's also information about a position at my company's charitable foundation. It's an entry-level job, nothing too demanding, but it comes with health insurance and a steady paycheck. Sarah always said you were good with numbers back before—" Harold stared at the envelope, his vision blurry with tears. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." "I'm doing it for Sarah," Alexander said simply. "She changed my life with her kindness and dedication. When I read her letter after the accident, about how she never stopped believing in her father, about how she wished she could have done more to help you, well, I made a promise to myself that I would find you and give you the chance she never could." The woman from the car stepped forward again. "We've also arranged for immediate, temporary accommodation at the Marriott Hotel, Mr. Miller. There's a room ready for you now, where you can clean up and rest while we process the paperwork for your apartment. We have some new clothes waiting there as well." Harold's hands trembled. as he reached for the envelope. "I don't deserve this." "Sarah thought you did," Alexander said firmly. "And I've learned to trust Sarah's judgment about people. She saw the good in everyone, even when they couldn't see it in themselves." A taxi pulled up behind the Rolls-Royce, and Alexander gestured toward it. "The choice is yours, Mr. Miller. You can stay here, or you can take this second chance. Sarah believed you would make the right choice if given the opportunity." Harold looked down at his cardboard sign, at the paper cup with its meager collection of coins. He thought about Sarah, about all the chances he'd wasted, about all the times he'd chosen the bottle over his own daughter. He thought about how she'd never given up on him, even after he'd given up on himself. With shaking legs, Harold stood up. Alexander reached out to steady him, and for the first time in years, Harold felt the firm, supportive grip of another human being who wasn't pushing him away or hurrying past. "I want to make her proud," Harold whispered, "even if it's too late." "It's never too late to honor someone's memory by becoming the person they always believed you could be," Alexander said, helping Harold toward the taxi. As Harold settled into the back seat, he clutched the envelope to his chest. Through the window, he watched Alexander return to his Rolls-Royce. The woman who'd brought the envelope smiled and waved before getting into the car with her boss. The taxi driver turned around. "Where to, sir?" Harold looked down at the envelope in his lap, at the Marriott logo on the hotel information sheet peeking out from inside. For the first time in years, he felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever: hope. "To the Marriott," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I'm going to the Marriott." As the taxi pulled away from the curb, Harold watched his cardboard sign grow smaller in the rear window. Somewhere he hoped Sarah was watching, and maybe, just maybe, she was smiling. The hot water felt like a miracle on Harold's skin as he stood in the Marriott Hotel's shower. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had more than a quick wash in a public bathroom sink. The hotel room was bigger than the motel unit he'd been living in, with its clean white sheets and thick carpets that his feet sank into. On the bed lay new clothes, simple but well-made items that Alexander Chen's assistant, had arranged for him. There was even a pair of reading glasses, the right prescription somehow, just like the ones he'd broken months ago and couldn't afford to replace. Harold's hands shook as he buttoned up the fresh shirt. The man in the mirror looked different already, clean-shaven, hair properly cut by the hotel's barber. But his eyes held the same haunted look, the weight of years of regret and missed opportunities. The phone on the bedside table rang, making him jump. It was Alexandra letting him know that lunch would be served in Mr. Chen's private dining room on the top floor in 30 minutes. Harold's stomach churned with nervous energy. When he stepped out of the elevator into the restaurant, Alexander Chen was already there, working on a laptop while he waited. He stood up and smiled warmly, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Mr. Miller, you look well. Please join me." Harold sat down carefully, still not quite believing this wasn't all some elaborate dream. A waiter appeared immediately with water and menus. "I hope you don't mind," Alexander said, "but I took the liberty of inviting someone else to join us. Someone who knew Sarah too." Before Harold could respond, a woman's voice came from behind him. "Mr. Miller?" He turned to see a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She was carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing a simple pearl necklace that reminded him of the one he'd given Sarah for her college graduation. "I'm Margaret Sullivan," she said, taking the seat between Harold and Alexander. "I was Sarah's neighbor in Boston for 3 years. She was like a daughter to me." Harold's throat tightened. "She never mentioned—" "No, she wouldn't have," Margaret said gently. "Not after things became difficult between you two. But she talked about you all the time, showed me old photos, told me stories about the good years, when you taught her to ride a bike and helped her with her math. Homework." Alexander signaled the waiter, who began bringing over their lunch. Harold stared down at the perfectly arranged plate, remembering countless meals missed or eaten from paper bags and soup kitchens. "Margaret runs our foundation's addiction recovery program," Alexander explained. "She's here to help if you're willing to accept it." Harold's hands clenched under the table. The word addiction still made him want to run, to deny, to hide behind the walls he'd built over years of drinking. Sarah came to see me, you know, Margaret said softly. About 6 months before the accident. She wanted advice about intervention programs, about ways to help you. She never gave up hope that you'd find your way back. I failed her, Harold whispered. I failed her so many times. You did, Margaret agreed, her voice kind but firm. But she believed you could still succeed. The question is, do you believe it? Harold looked up at these two strangers who seemed to care more about his welfare than he had in years. I'm scared, he admitted. I've tried to quit before, it never stuck. You were alone then, Alexander pointed out. You're not alone anymore. Margaret opened her briefcase and took out a folder. We have a place for you at our residential treatment center. 3 months of intensive therapy followed by outpatient support. The job at the foundation will still be there when you're ready. Harold stared at the folder. 3 months. 3 months to try to undo years of damage, to learn to live without the crutch that had cost him everything. What if I fail again? Then we'll help you try again, Margaret said simply. That's what Sarah would have wanted. Alexander leaned forward. When Sarah first came to work for me, I was not a good person to work for. I was demanding, impatient, focused only on results. But she saw through that, saw the person I could be. She taught me about compassion, about second chances. Now it's my turn to pass that lesson on. Harold picked up his water glass, remembering how his hands used to shake so badly in the morning that he could barely hold a cup until he got that first drink. They were steady now. When can I start? Margaret smiled. Today, if you're ready. I have a car waiting downstairs. What about my things at the motel? Alexandra has already arranged for everything to be collected, Alexander assured him. Anything you need replaced will be replaced. Harold stood up slowly. I never imagined anyone would care, Margaret finished for him. Sarah cared. She never stopped caring, and now we care too. As they rode the elevator down to the lobby, Harold thought about all the elevators in all the office buildings he'd been thrown out of over the years, all the doors that had closed in his face. But this elevator was going up toward a future he'd thought was lost forever. The car waiting outside wasn't the Rolls-Royce this time, but a comfortable SUV with tinted windows. Margaret got in beside him while Alexander stayed behind. I'll visit in a few weeks, Alexander promised. When you're settled, we have a lot to talk about. Sarah left letters for you. But first, focus on getting better. As the car pulled away. From the curb, Harold watched the city streets pass by. The same streets he'd slept on, begged on, lost himself on. Now they were taking him somewhere new, somewhere his daughter had always hoped he'd find his way to. Tell me about the program, he said to Margaret, his voice stronger than it had been in years. Tell me everything I need to know. And as Margaret began to explain, Harold felt something bloom in his chest, not hope this time, but determination. He would do this. For Sarah, for himself, for the man he used to be and the man he might still become. The city faded behind them as they drove, toward the treatment center, toward the beginning of whatever came next. Harold closed his eyes and whispered a silent promise to his daughter. This time would be different. This time, he would make her proud. The treatment center looked more like a country club than a hospital. Surrounded by tall pine trees and well-kept gardens, the red brick building welcomed Harold with warm lights glowing in its windows. But despite its peaceful appearance, the next few days would prove to be the hardest of Harold's life. The withdrawal symptoms hit him like a freight train. He shook, sweated, and fought against demons that had lived in his system for years. The medical staff stayed with him around the clock, monitoring his vital signs and giving him medications to ease the worst of it. Through the fog of detox, he heard gentle voices encouraging him, felt cool cloths on his forehead, and somehow managed to hold on to the thought of Sarah. Margaret visited every day, sitting quietly beside his bed and reading from Sarah's old letters to her. Harold learned about his daughter's life in Boston, her promotion at work, her volunteer activities at the local animal shelter, her dream of opening her own business someday. Each word was a knife in his heart, reminding him of all he'd missed, but also a lifeline pulling him through the darkness. By the end of his first week, the physical withdrawal symptoms began to ease. That's when the real work started. Group therapy sessions filled his mornings, while afternoons were dedicated to individual counseling. Harold found himself sharing things he'd buried so deep he'd almost forgotten them existed. "I was good at my job," he told his counselor, Dr. Rivera, during one session. "I had everything, the corner office, the respect of my colleagues, my daughter's love. Then the market crashed in 2008. I lost clients' money. Good people, retirement accounts wiped out. I couldn't face them. Started drinking at lunch, then breakfast. Sarah tried to help, but I pushed her away. Couldn't stand to see the disappointment in her eyes." Dr. Rivera listened without judgment, helping Harold understand the difference between explanation and excuse, between guilt and genuine remorse. "You can't change the past," she would say, "but you can learn from it. Your daughter believed in redemption. Now it's time for you to believe in it too." 1 month into his stay, Alexander Chen came to visit. He brought more letters, ones Sarah had written but never sent, saved in a box found after her death. Harold read them slowly, treasuring each word, each glimpse into his daughter's heart. "Dear Dad," one letter began, "I saw a man playing chess in the park today, teaching his granddaughter the game. Remember how you used to play with me? You were so patient, explaining each move, letting me win sometimes, but not so often that I didn't learn. I miss that, Dad. I know he's still in there somewhere." Alexander sat quietly while Harold read, offering nothing but his presence and understanding. When Harold finally looked up, tears streaming down his face, Alexander shared his own story. "I was raised to believe that business success was everything," he said. "Emotions were weakness. Kindness was inefficiency. Then Sarah became my assistant. She brought cookies to staff meetings, remembered everyone's birthdays, asked about people's families. I thought it was unprofessional at first, but then I noticed something. My team worked harder, stayed longer, cared more. She taught me that strength isn't about being hard, it's about being whole." As weeks turned into months, Harold felt himself changing. The fog of alcohol lifted from his mind, leaving him sharper, more present. He started taking walks in the garden, relearning the simple pleasure of feeling sun on his face without craving. A drink. In group therapy, he found himself reaching out to others, sharing his experience, offering hope to newcomers still shaking and scared. Margaret brought him news about the foundation job, a position helping to review grant applications for addiction treatment programs. "Who better to understand the needs than someone who's walked the path?" she said. The irony wasn't lost on Harold. During his 3rd month, Dr. Rivera suggested he write a letter to Sarah. "Not to send, obviously," she explained, "but to say the things you wish you could have said." Harold spent days on that letter, writing and rewriting, pouring out years of regret and love and missed opportunities. When he finally finished, Margaret suggested they hold a small ceremony in the garden. Harold read the letter aloud, his voice steady, even through tears, while Margaret, Alexander, and some of the other residents stood nearby in support. "My dearest Sarah," he read, "I'm sorry it took losing you to find myself again. I'm sorry I wasted so many chances to tell you I love you, to show you I could be the father you deserved. But I promise you this, I will spend whatever time I have left trying to be the man you always believed I could be." They buried the letter under a young cherry tree, planting hope alongside grief. As they walked back to the building, Margaret touched Harold's arm gently. "You know, the Foundation's addiction program needs a spokesperson, someone who can talk to families, share their story, give them hope. Would you be interested?" Harold thought about all the people out there like him, lost, alone, thinking it was too late to change. He thought about Sarah, about how she never stopped believing in the power of second chances. "Yes," he said, "I would like that very much." That night in his room, Harold looked at his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him was different from the one who'd arrived 3 months ago, stronger, clearer, more at peace. There was still sadness in his eyes, there always would be, but there was purpose too. On his bedside table sat a framed photo of Sarah that Alexander had given him. In it, she was laughing, her head thrown back, joy radiating from her face. Harold touched the glass gently. "I'm getting there, sweetheart," he whispered. "I'm getting there." Outside his window, the cherry tree stood in the moonlight, its branches reaching toward the stars. Somewhere in its roots lay Harold's letter, his promises, his hopes. And in the quiet of the night, as he prepared for sleep without the need for alcohol to numb him, Harold felt Sarah's presence. Not as a ghost of guilt, but as a guardian angel, watching over his journey home to himself. Harold's first day at the Chen Foundation felt like stepping into another world. The modern office building in downtown Boston sparkled with glass and steel, a far cry from the street corners where he'd spent the last few years. Alexandra met him in the lobby, her warm smile helping to calm his nerves. "Welcome to your new home away from home, Mr. Miller," she said, handing him an employee badge. The photo showed him as he looked now, clean-shaven, clear-eyed, wearing a proper suit. Sometimes he still had trouble recognizing himself. His office was small but comfortable, with a window overlooking the city. On the desk sat a framed photo of Sarah, a different one this time, showing her at her college graduation. Harold touched it gently, remembering how proud he'd been that day. "Sarah's old office is just down the hall," Alexandra mentioned softly. "Mr. Chen never rented it out after. Well, he kept it as a kind of memorial. Her things are still there if you'd ever like to see them." Harold nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Alexandra seemed to understand, quietly explaining his duties, reviewing grant applications, speaking with treatment centers, sharing his story with families struggling with addiction. That afternoon, his first appointment arrived. A woman about Sarah's age sat across from his desk, twisting a tissue in her hands. "My father," she began, her voice breaking. "He won't admit he has a problem. He's losing everything, just like I lost my mum to cancer last year. I don't want to lose him too." Harold listened, seeing himself in her father, seeing Sarah in her. When she finished, he shared his own story. Not just the recovery, but the years of denial, the pain he'd caused, the chances he'd thrown away. "But it's not too late," he told her. "It's never too late to change, to heal, to rebuild. Your father just needs to know he's not alone." By day's end, Harold had spoken with 3 families, reviewed 2 grant applications and made plans to visit a local treatment center. His head spun with the responsibility, the trust being placed in him. Alexander stopped by as Harold was preparing to leave. "Dinner," he suggested. "There's someone I'd like you to meet." The restaurant was elegant but comfortable. A woman was already seated at their table, middle-aged, elegant, with Sarah's smile. Harold froze when Alexander made the introduction. "Harold, this is Diana, Sarah's birth mother." Diana stood, her eyes filled with tears. "Hello, Harold. It's been a long time. 28 years, to be exact." Diana had been just 19 when she gave birth to Sarah, a scared college student who knew she couldn't provide the life her baby deserved. Harold and his late wife, Emily, had adopted Sarah when she was 3 days old. "Sarah found me 5 years ago," Diana explained as they sat down. "She wanted to know her medical history, but we ended up becoming friends. She told me about you, about Emily, about the wonderful childhood you gave her." Harold's hands shook as he reached for his water glass. Did she tell you about later? About what I became?" Diana nodded sadly. "She was worried about you. We talked about it often. After the accident, Alexander found me, told me about his promise to Sarah. I've been helping with the Foundation's adoption support programs." "Diana has been instrumental in creating bridges between birth parents and adoptive families," Alexander added, "especially in cases involving addiction." Throughout dinner, Diana shared stories about her relationship with Sarah. Lunch dates, shopping trips, long talks about life and love. Each story was a gift, a new piece of his daughter's life that Harold hadn't known about. "She never replaced you," Diana assured him. "She just made her heart bigger, made room for more love. That's who Sarah was." Later that night, in his new apartment, Harold finally found the courage to enter the spare bedroom. Alexander's people had collected his few belongings from the motel, but they'd also brought boxes from Sarah's apartment, things her landlord had kept in storage after her death. Inside the first box, he found photo albums, birthday cards, and a journal. The last entry was dated 3 days before the accident. "Had lunch with Diana today. We talked about Dad again. She understands why I can't give up on him. She knows what it's like to miss someone, to wonder if they're okay, to hope they'll find their way back. Sometimes love means waiting, even when it hurts. Sometimes love means believing in someone even when they've stopped believing in themselves. Harold sat on the floor, surrounded by pieces of his daughter's life, and let himself really cry for the first time since hearing of her death. He cried for the years wasted, for the love he'd pushed away, for the second chance he'd gotten too late to share with her. The next morning, he arrived early at the office. Sarah's old room was unlocked, just as Alexandra had said. He stood in the doorway, taking in the space where his daughter had spent so much of her time. The small plants on the windowsill still alive thanks to Alexandra's care, the photos on the walls, the coffee mug still sitting on the desk. "I thought I might find you here." Margaret stood behind him holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one and joined him in the doorway. "Diana told me about dinner," she said. "How are you feeling?" Harold sipped his coffee, real coffee, not the instant stuff from his motel days. "Like I'm getting to know my daughter all over again, like I'm finding pieces of her everywhere." "That's exactly what she wanted," Margaret said softly. "She left all these breadcrumbs, all these connections, hoping someday you'd be ready to follow them home." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the morning sun fill Sarah's office with light. On her desk calendar, still open to the month of her death, Harold could see his name written on every Saturday. "Try Dad again." She had never given up. And now, surrounded by the life she'd built, the people she'd touched, the love she'd left behind, Harold made another promise to her memory, neither would he. Life at the Chen Foundation settled into a steady rhythm for Harold. Each morning he walked the 6 blocks from his apartment to the office, stopping at the same coffee shop where Sarah used to get her daily latte. The baristas there still remembered her, her smile, her kindness, her generous tips. One rainy Tuesday, Harold arrived at work to find an unexpected visitor waiting in his office. The man was in his 60s, wearing an expensive but rumpled suit with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands that Harold recognized all too well. "Mr. Miller." The man stood awkwardly. "I'm Richard Thompson, my daughter Emily. She's the one who came to see you last week about my problem." Harold gestured for him to sit down. "I remember Emily. She loves you very much." Richard collapsed into the chair, his carefully maintained facade crumbling. "I saw myself in your story. When Emily told me about meeting you, about how you lost your daughter, I couldn't sleep, kept thinking about what would happen to Emily if you didn't make it back," Harold finished gently. "I know that fear. I lived with it for years. Want to tell me about it?" For the next hour, Richard poured out his story. The high-pressure job, the gradual slide into drinking, the failed attempts to stop on his own. Harold listened, seeing his own past reflected in every word. "I'm scared," Richard admitted finally. "Terrified, actually. What if I'm not strong enough?" Harold leaned forward. "Can I show you something?" He led Richard down the hall to Sarah's office. The room had become a kind of sanctuary, not just for Harold, but for others at the foundation. The plants still thrived, and Sarah's personal touches remained untouched. "My daughter sat at this desk for 3 years, Harold said. "Every week, she tried to reach me. I was too drunk, too ashamed to answer. Now I'd give anything for one more chance to pick up that phone. Don't wait until it's too late, Richard. Take the chance while you still have it." That afternoon, Harold personally drove Richard to the treatment center. As they pulled up to the familiar building, he saw not just Richard's fear, but his own memories of that first day. "I'll be here," Harold promised, every step of the way. Back at the office, Harold found Alexander waiting with unexpected news. "The board has approved your proposal," he announced. "The Sarah Miller Second Chance program is officially funded." Harold sat down hard, overwhelmed. The program had been his dream, a comprehensive support system for families affected by addiction, combining treatment scholarships with counseling, job training, and housing assistance. "We're allocating $5 million for the first year," Alexander continued. "Diana has agreed to help coordinate the family support services, and there's something else." He handed Harold an envelope. "Sarah's last project proposal. We found it in her files." With trembling fingers, Harold opened the envelope. Inside was a detailed plan for almost exactly the program he'd proposed. right down to the scholarship structure and family counseling. Component. She was going to present it the week after. Alexander's voice trailed off. She never got the chance. But you did, Harold. You're making her dream real. That evening, Harold had dinner with Diana. These meals had become a weekly tradition, a chance for both of them to share memories of Sarah and support each other through their grief. I visited her grave today, Diana said softly. Told her about the program, about you. She would be so proud, Harold. Harold stared down at his plate. Sometimes I wonder if I deserve any of this. The job, the program, even these dinners with you. After everything I threw away, Diana reached across the table and took his hand. Sarah understood something that took me years to learn. Love isn't about deserving. It's about giving. And sometimes it's about receiving, even when we think we don't deserve it. Later that night, Harold sat in his apartment, looking through the photo album he'd found in Sarah's things. There was a whole section labeled Dad, pictures from before the drinking before the fall, birthday parties, beach trips, school plays, and at the very end, a photo he'd never seen before. It showed him on his old street corner, taken from a distance. On the back, in Sarah's handwriting, "Still waiting, Dad, still believing." His phone buzzed, a text from Margaret. Richard Thompson had made it through his first day of treatment. His daughter Emily was with him, just as Sarah had. Tried to be there for Harold. Harold walked to his window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, another family was starting their journey back from the brink. Another daughter was getting a chance he and Sarah never had. "We're doing it, sweetheart," he whispered to Sarah's memory. "We're helping them find their way home." The next morning, Harold stopped at his usual coffee shop. The barista smiled as he approached. "The usual, Mr. Miller?" "Actually," he said, "I'll have what Sarah used to order. A vanilla latte with an extra shot." The barista's smile softened. She always said the extra shot was to handle her dad's paperwork when he finally came to work with her. Harold took the coffee, its warmth seeping into his hands like Sarah's endless hope had finally seeped into his heart. He walked to the office, ready for another day of turning that hope into help for others. In his office, the morning sun caught Sarah's photo, making her smile seem to glow. On his desk lay the files of 3 new families reaching out for help, each one a chance to honor her memory, each one an opportunity to prove that love, even after loss, could still change lives. The autumn chill swept through Boston as Harold prepared for the first major fundraising gala for the Sarah Miller II Chancer program. The ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel buzzed with activity as workers hung banners and arranged tables. A large portrait of Sarah smiled down from the stage. "The governor confirmed he's coming," Alexandra said, checking her tablet. "And 3 major news networks want to cover the event." Harold adjusted his new tuxedo, a gift from Alexander. 6 months into his new life, he still felt strange in fancy clothes, but tonight wasn't about him. It was about Sarah's dream. Richard Thompson arrived early with his daughter Emily. 3 months sober, he looked like a different man, clear-eyed and standing straight. He'd become one of the program's biggest supporters, convincing his company to donate generously. "I never thought I'd be here," Richard said, embracing Harold. "Thank you for showing me the way back." Emily hugged Harold too. "You gave me my father back." The ballroom filled quickly. Business leaders, politicians, and families touched by addiction mingled together. Diana worked the room expertly, sharing her story, connecting with potential donors. She'd become not just a colleague, but a true friend to Harold. Their shared love for Sarah creating an unexpected bond. Alexander took the stage first. 2 years ago, I lost my most valued employee and friend. Sarah Miller saw the good in everyone, even when they couldn't see it themselves. Tonight, we honor her memory by continuing her work. Harold watched from the wings, his heart pounding. He was next to speak. Margaret appeared beside him, squeezing his hand. "Just tell them your truth," she whispered. The spotlight felt hot as Harold stepped up to the microphone. Looking out at the crowd, he saw not the wealthy donors and politicians, but all the lost souls still out there waiting for someone to believe in them. "My name is Harold Miller," he began, his voice steady. 2 years ago, I was homeless, hopeless, and drunk. My daughter Sarah never stopped trying to save me, But I wasn't ready to be saved. I lost her before I found my way back. But Sarah, his voice caught. Sarah left behind a network of angels, people she'd touched with her kindness, people who carried on her work of believing in second chances. He told them everything. The street corner, Alexander's appearance, the treatment center, the foundation. As he spoke, photos appeared on the screens behind him. Sarah, through the years, the treatment center, successful program participants with their families. Tonight, we're launching a nationwide expansion of the program, Harold announced. 10. New treatment centers, family support services in every major city, job training programs and housing assistance. We can't bring Sarah back, but we can make sure her spirit of hope and redemption lives on. The applause was thunderous. Checkbooks came out. Pledges were made. By the end of the night, the program had secured funding for the next 5 years. Later, as the cleanup crew worked around them, Harold sat with Diana and Alexander at one of the empty tables. Diana held up her glass of sparkling water. "To Sarah," she said softly. "To Sarah," they echoed. "There's something else we need to discuss," Alexander said, pulling out a folder. "The board wants to create a new position, National Director of Recovery Services. We'd like you to take it, Harold." Harold stared at the offer letter. The salary was more than he'd ever made, even in his best years at the investment firm. But it wasn't about the money. It would mean traveling. Alexander continued, sharing your story, setting up new programs, training other recovered addicts to become counselors, spreading Sarah's message across the country. "You don't have to decide right away," Diana added, "but Sarah always said your greatest gift was connecting with people. This would let you use that gift to help others." Harold thought about the scared, broken man he'd been just 6 months ago, about all the other broken people still out there, waiting for someone to offer them hope. "I'll do it," he said, "for Sarah." The next morning, Harold visited Sarah's grave. The cherry trees they'd planted were beginning to turn red and gold. He placed a program from the gala against her headstone. "We raised $12 million last night, sweetheart," he said softly. $12 million to help other fathers find their way back to their daughters before it's too late. I wish you could see it." A warm breeze stirred the leaves, and for a moment, Harold felt Sarah's presence, not as a ghost of regret, but as a guiding light, showing him the way forward. Back at the office, 3 new families waited to meet with him. Harold straightened his tie, touched Sarah's photo on his desk, and opened his door to welcome them in. "My name is Harold Miller," he said, "and I'm here to tell you that it's never too late for a second chance." Harold's first trip as national director took him to Chicago. The winter wind whipped off Lake Michigan as he stood outside a rundown community center in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. Inside, 20 recovering addicts waited to hear his story. Among them sat Michael Chen, Alexander's younger brother. Harold hadn't known about him until Alexander called late one night, voice breaking with worry. Michael had been in and out of rehab 5 times, burning through his trust fund and family connections. Now he was living in a halfway house, holding on to sobriety one day at a time. "I didn't know who else to call," Alexander had admitted. "He won't listen to me anymore." Harold looked at Michael now, seeing the family resemblance, the same sharp features as Alexander, but hollowed by years of drug use. The younger Chen sat slumped in his chair, radiating defensive anger. "My name is Harold Miller," he began, telling his story once again. But this time, he added something new. He talked about Alexander, how this powerful businessman had stopped his car that day, how he'd kept a promise to a dead woman he'd respected, how he'd given a broken old man a chance at redemption. Michael's head lifted slightly. "Your brother," Harold said, looking directly at him, "learned from my daughter that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who ask for help, who admit they can't do it alone." After the meeting, Michael lingered. "Did Alex really send you?" "He loves you," Harold said simply. "Just like Sarah loved me. Sometimes we're too lost in our own darkness to see the light others are trying to show us." That night, Harold called Alexander. "He's agreed to enter our program, the full program. Treatment, counseling, job training." Alexander's relief was palpable even through the phone. "Thank you. I've been so afraid of losing him like you lost Sarah. We won't let that happen, Harold promised. The next few months became a whirlwind of cities and stories. Harold spoke at treatment centers, hospitals, prisons, anywhere people needed hope. Diana coordinated family support services in each new location, while Margaret trained local counselors. In Philadelphia, a teenage girl hugged him after his talk. "My mum's been sober 3 weeks because of your program," she said. "She's really trying this time." In Miami, a judge asked him to address her drug court participants. "They need to see that recovery is possible," she explained, "that it's never too late." Between trips, Harold kept tabs on Michael's progress. The younger Chen struggled at first, fighting the program's structure, testing boundaries. But slowly, like a flower turning toward the sun, he began to change. "Why are you doing this?" Michael asked during one of their weekly calls. "You don't even know me." "Because someone did it for me," Harold replied. "And because your brother did more than save my life, he helped me honor my daughter's memory. Now it's my turn to help him keep his brother." Spring came to Boston, and with it, a milestone celebration at the treatment center where Harold's journey had begun. Michael Chen had completed 6 months of sobriety. Alexander flew in for the ceremony. The two brothers stood awkwardly at first, years of pain and mistrust between them. Then Michael spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I found Sarah's letters in your office," he said to Alexander. "The ones about her dad, about never giving up hope. That's why you helped him, isn't it? Because you saw me in him." Alexander nodded, unable to speak. Michael took a step forward and hugged his brother for the first time in years. Harold watched from across the room, remembering all the hugs he'd never given Sarah. Later, in the garden where Harold had buried his letter to Sarah, Michael placed his 6-month sobriety chip at the base of the cherry tree. Alexander stood beside him, one hand on his brother's shoulder. "I've been thinking," Michael said to Harold, "about working for the program, maybe helping other addicts from wealthy families, people who think money can solve everything except the hole inside them." Harold smiled. "Sarah would like that." That night, Harold added a new photo to his desk, Michael and Alexander Chen standing together under the cherry tree, another broken family finding their way back together. Another piece of Sarah's legacy growing stronger. His phone buzzed with a text from Diana. 3 new centers approved for the West Coast. Ready to pack your bags again?" Harold touched Sarah's photo. "We're really doing it, sweetheart. We're really making a difference." Outside his window, the cherry trees were blooming again, their pink petals dancing in the spring breeze like hope made visible. Somewhere out there, another family was about to find their second chance. Another lost soul was about to discover. They weren't alone, and in each of them, Sarah's spirit lived on. In every reunion, every milestone, every moment of grace snatched back from the darkness of addiction. Her father hadn't been able to find his way back in time to share it with her, but he could make sure others didn't make the same mistake. One second chance at a time, one story at a time, one miracle at a time. 1 year after the launch of the Sarah Miller Second Chance program, Harold stood in his office packing for another trip. Photos covered his walls now, smiling faces of families reunited, addicts celebrating sobriety milestones, new treatment centers opening across the country. The phone on his desk rang. It was Richard Thompson calling with unexpected news. "My company's board just voted unanimously. We're donating $20 million to expand the program internationally." Harold sat down hard in his chair. "International? Starting with London and Toronto," Richard explained. "Emily's been working on the proposal for months. She says it's time Sarah's legacy went global." After hanging up, Harold walked down to Sarah's old office. The room had become a kind of memorial. Every week, someone left fresh flowers on her desk. Today, it was a bouquet of yellow roses from Michael Chen, who now ran the program's youth outreach division. Harold touched the roses, gently, remembering how Sarah used to keep yellow roses on her desk at home. A memory stirred. Her 10th birthday, when he'd filled her room with yellow roses while she slept. The joy on her face when she woke up. "I thought I'd find you here." Diana stood in the doorway, elegant as always in her tailored suit. She'd become the program's chief operating officer, turning Sarah's dream into an efficient, effective organization that helped thousands. Richard called you too? She nodded. Alexander's already working on the legal details. But that's not why I came looking for you. There's someone here you need to meet. In the conference room sat a woman in her early 30s clutching a worn envelope. She stood when Harold entered, her hands shaking slightly. Mr. Miller, I'm Rachel Davis. I was with Sarah in the accident. Harold felt the room spin. Diana grabbed his arm, helping him into a chair. I've been trying to find the courage to come for months, Rachel continued. The doctors said I couldn't have visitors at first, and then when I got out of the hospital, no one knew how to reach you. She opened the envelope, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. Sarah was conscious for a little while after the crash. She wrote this. She made me promise to find you to make sure you got it. Harold stared at the paper in Rachel's trembling hands, his daughter's last words. She talked about you, Rachel said softly. While we waited for the ambulance, she told me about the program she wanted to create, about how she never stopped believing you'd find your way back. She made me promise to tell you that she loved you, that she understood, that she forgave you. Tears rolled down Harold's cheeks as he took the paper. Sarah's handwriting was shaky but clear. Dad, if you're reading this, I didn't make it, but that doesn't mean you can't. I've always believed in you, even when you stopped believing in yourself. There's so much good you could do, so many people. You could help. Don't let my death be the end of hope. Let it be the beginning. I love you, I forgive you, now forgive yourself. Sarah. Diana wrapped her arms around Harold as he sobbed. Rachel wiped her own tears, continuing her story. Sarah saved my life that night. She pushed me toward the passenger side when she saw the truck coming. That's why I survived. She was still trying to help people right until the end. Later that evening, Harold sat in his apartment, reading and rereading Sarah's note. His phone kept buzzing with messages about the international expansion, but he couldn't focus on that yet. A knock at his door revealed Alexander and Michael Chen. Without a word, they came in, bringing pizza and understanding. The three men sat together, sharing quiet solidarity in their joint journeys of loss and redemption. You know what Sarah would say about the international expansion? Michael said finally. She'd say, "What took you so long?" Harold laughed. Through his tears. She always thought bigger than the rest of us. Then let's think bigger, Alexander said. Let's make this worldwide. Every city, every country where people need hope. No limits. Harold looked at Sarah's note again. Don't. Let my death be the end of hope. Let it be the beginning. Rachel said Sarah was still trying to help people with her last breath. He said quietly, "How can we do any less?" The next morning, Harold called an emergency board meeting. Standing at the front of the conference room, Sarah's last note in his pocket, he looked at the faces around him. Diana, Alexander, Michael, Margaret, Richard and Emily Thompson, and now Rachel Davis. Sarah believed that love was stronger than addiction, he began. Stronger than shame, stronger than fear, stronger even than death. She believed that no one was ever too far gone to find their way back. It's time we proved her right on a global scale. As they began to plan, Harold felt Sarah's presence more strongly than ever, not as a ghost of regret, but as a guiding light, showing them the way forward. Her forgiveness, finally delivered through Rachel's courage, had freed him to forgive himself. The work ahead would be challenging, but Sarah had always loved a challenge. And now, with her last words close to his heart, Harold was ready to take her dream worldwide. He touched the note in his pocket. We're going global, sweetheart, just like you always wanted. Your light's going to shine all over the world. 2 years into the international expansion of the Sarah Miller Second Chance program, Harold stepped off a plane in London. The city's grey skies and drizzling rain reminded him of Boston, of mornings spent on street corners, begging for change. The London centre occupied an old Victorian mansion, its brick walls covered with ivy. Inside, warmth and hope had replaced decay. Harold walked through halls filled with recovering addicts and their families, all part of Sarah's growing legacy. Emma Blackwood, the centre's director, greeted him with a warm hug. Once a homeless addict herself, She'd been one of the program's first international success stories. "We're at capacity already," she reported, "and there's a waiting list 100 names long. But that's not why I asked you to come." She led him to her office where a distinguished-looking man in his 70s waited. "Harold, meet Lord William Ashworth. He's been following our work." The elderly aristocrat stood, leaning heavily on a carved cane. "Mr. Miller, your daughter's story. It touched me deeply. You see, I lost my son James to addiction 20 years ago. I've spent 2 decades blaming myself, drowning in guilt and regret." Harold recognized the pain in the man's eyes. He saw it in his own mirror every morning. "I've decided to establish a foundation," Lord Ashworth continued, £500 million, dedicated to opening Sarah Miller centres across Europe. "But I have one condition." He paused, his voice rough with emotion. "I want them called the Sarah and James Centres, 2 children who never gave up hope, even when their fathers couldn't see the way forward." Harold sat down hard, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gift and its meaning. Sarah would be honoured. That evening, in his hotel room, Harold called Diana. Their weekly dinners had evolved into daily phone calls, their shared love for Sarah growing into something neither had expected. £500 million, he told her. "Can you imagine what we can do with that?" Diana's voice was warm. Sarah always said one person's hope could change the world. She just didn't know it would be her hope doing the changing. The next morning, Harold visited a London street corner where addicts gathered. A young woman there reminded him of Sarah, the same age, the same kind eyes. But she was holding a sign asking for help, just as he once had. Harold sat down beside her. "Let me tell you a story about my daughter, Sarah." By day's end, the young woman, Katie, had agreed to enter the program. As Harold helped her into the car that would take her to the center, she asked, "Why do you care what happens to me?" "Because my daughter taught me that everyone deserves a second chance," he answered. "And sometimes it takes one person believing in you before you can believe in yourself." Back in Boston a week later, Harold found Michael Chen waiting in his office. The younger Chen brother had transformed completely, 3 years sober, running youth programs in 10 countries. "Got something to show you," Michael said, pulling up a video on his laptop. The screen showed hundreds of people standing in front of treatment centers around the world: London, Paris, Tokyo, Sydney. Each person held a yellow rose, Sarah's favorite, flower. "They all recorded messages," Michael explained. "People you've helped, families you've brought back together. We're playing it at next month's global fundraising gala." Harold watched faces appear one after another, telling their stories of recovery and reunion. A father in Mumbai, now sober, walking his daughter down the wedding aisle. A teenager in Rio, clean for 2 years, graduating high school. A grandmother in Berlin, celebrating 5 years of sobriety, surrounded by her family. The last face was Rachel Davis, the woman who'd been with Sarah in her final moments. "Thank you, Mr. Miller, for turning your grief into hope. Sarah saved my life that night. Through you, she's still saving lives every day." That weekend, Harold and Diana visited Sarah's grave together. The cherry tree had grown tall and strong, its branches spreading wide. They sat on a bench beneath it, hands clasped. "Lord Ashworth's gift means we can help so many more people," Harold said softly. "But sometimes I wonder, would it have happened if I'd found my way back while Sarah was alive? Was my loss the price that had to be paid?" Diana squeezed his hand. "Sarah knew something we're only learning now, that love doesn't end with loss, it transforms, changes shape, becomes something new." Harold touched the rough bark of the cherry tree. "A year ago, Rachel brought me Sarah's last words. She told me to let her death be the beginning of hope, not the end. I didn't understand then, but now you're helping people write new endings to their stories," Diana finished. "The ending Sarah wanted for you." Above them, the cherry blossoms danced in the breeze, their pale pink petals falling like gentle rain. Each one a prayer, a promise, a piece of hope carried on the wind to someone who needed it. In his pocket, Harold carried Sarah's last note, worn soft from constant reading. But he didn't need to take it out anymore. Her words lived in his heart, in every life touched by the program, in every family restored. Tomorrow he would fly to Paris to open another center. Next week, it would be Berlin. The work never ended, but that was okay. Because every time he told Sarah's story, every time he reached out to someone lost in darkness, she lived again. And somewhere he knew she was smiling. 5 years to the day after Alexander Chen found Harold on that street corner, the Sarah Miller Second Chance program had grown beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Treatment centers operated in 30 countries, helping thousands of families find their way back from addiction's darkness. Harold stood at the podium in New York's largest convention center, facing an audience of 5,000. Recovered addicts, their families, counselors, and supporters filled every seat. On the massive screens behind him, live feeds showed similar gatherings in London, Paris, Tokyo, and Sydney. 5 years ago, I was lost, Harold began. My daughter Sarah believed in second chances, but I couldn't accept the ones she offered. I thought I'd run out of chances when she died. I was wrong. In the front row sat the people who'd become his family. Alexander and Michael Chen, Diana, Margaret, Richard and Emily Thompson, Rachel Davis and Lord Ashworth. But there was someone new among them today, someone who made Harold's heart beat faster. Diana wore a simple gold band on her left hand, matching the one Harold had placed there just last week in a quiet ceremony under Sarah's cherry tree. They'd fallen in love slowly, brought together by shared grief but united by hope. Sarah left us a blueprint, Harold continued, not just for recovery but for living. She showed us that love doesn't end with loss, that hope can grow even in the darkest places, that it's never too late to change. The screens behind him filled with faces, thousands of program graduates around the world, each holding a yellow rose. Today we're announcing the Sarah Miller Legacy Fund, $1 billion, dedicated to ensuring that no one is ever turned away from treatment because they can't afford it. No one has to lose their Sarah before finding their way back. The applause was deafening, but Harold wasn't finished. And there's something else, something Sarah dreamed of but never got to see. Michael Chen stepped up beside him. 3 years sober now, he'd become the program's most passionate advocate. Starting next month, Michael announced, the Sarah Miller Second Chance program will open its first medical school scholarship program. We're going to train a new generation of addiction specialists who understand recovery from the inside out, who know that healing takes more than medicine, it takes hope. In the audience, a young woman stood up. Katie, the girl Harold had found, on that London street corner, now 2 years sober and accepted to medical school. This is Sarah's real legacy, Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. Not just the lives she touched directly, but the ripples of hope that keep spreading. Every person we help becomes someone who can help others. After the ceremony, Harold and Diana walked through Central Park. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves. Do you think she knows? Diana asked softly. How many lives she saved? Harold squeezed her hand. I think she always knew what was possible. She saw the best in everyone, even when we couldn't see it in ourselves. His phone buzzed, a text from Rachel. Another Sarah and James Center was opening in Melbourne next month. Would he and Diana come? Remember when Alexander found you? Diana said. One man in a luxury car stopping to help one homeless addict. Harold nodded. Sarah orchestrated that, you know. Even after she was gone, she was still trying to save me. She left all those breadcrumbs. Alexander, you, Margaret, Rachel. And now look, Diana gestured at the city around them. Thousands of Alexanders, stopping for thousands of Harolds. That night in their apartment overlooking the city, Harold took out Sarah's last note. He didn't need to read it anymore. The words were etched in his heart. But sometimes he liked to trace her handwriting, to feel the connection to her final moments of hope. Diana brought him a cup of tea, settling beside him on the couch. I have something to tell you. Harold looked at his new wife, saw the joy shining in her eyes. I'm pregnant, she said softly. A girl. And I was thinking, if it's okay with you. Sarah, Harold whispered. We'll call her Sarah. Diana nodded, tears sparkling. Sarah Diana Miller, a new beginning. Harold pulled her close, his hand resting gently on her stomach. Outside their window, the city sparkled with a million lights. each one representing a soul, finding their way home in the darkness. Tomorrow he would tell more stories, help more families, spread more hope. The work would never end, but that was all right. Because every day, in every city around the world, someone was getting their second chance. And somewhere, Harold knew, Sarah was watching. Not as a ghost of regret anymore, but as an angel of hope, her light shining through every life touched by her legacy, every heart opened by her love. The circle was complete. A father's grief had become a daughter's gift to the world, and in the new life growing beneath his hand, Sarah's spirit would live on, not just in memory but in flesh and blood, in a new generation of hope and second chances. Harold kissed Diana's forehead and whispered the words he'd learned were always true. "It's never too late for love to find its way home."